Thanks for joining us and listening to another God-lived and God-breathed message by Darius Nelms. Our mission is to increase our generation standard back to God's standard of excellence and kingdom living through personal development, relational wisdom, business management, and faith increase. Our aim is that this message inspires and infuses you to reach your next level of living and helps you discover your rightful place in God's kingdom. Now, let's dive into the message.
Friends, thank you for tuning in for another episode as we get through the book overview of my latest book entitled Why Me? 5 Strategies for How Good People Can Overcome Bad Situations. Today we are on strategy 4, which is identifying the 2 types of enemies. Strategy 4, identifying the 2 types of enemies. So we'll be kind of discussing this in detail, understanding the 2 types of enemies. And there's a dual enemy that we need to address. And this dual enemy, the dual enemies that we face are external and internal, meaning that the external enemies are those that are outward, declaring war on you. And then the internal and inward enemy is the enemy from within. You are sometimes your own worst enemy. And an enemy by definition is someone who threatens your forward progression, meaning that physically they are standing in your way from getting to the next level. And of course, this has to be according to God's will, right? According to God's will. You can't be trying to be a drug dealer and your parents are standing in the way of you being a drug dealer and committing crime and taking lives. And you are sitting here talking about your parents are your enemy. No. That's not how that works. Again, this has to be within God's will, right? You cannot try to harm society and think that someone's not supposed to stand in front of you to keep you from harming society. That's not how that works. But again, this is within the scope of God's will. So an enemy is anyone who stands between you and your God-given destiny. And they are trying to thwart your forward progression from achieving the things that God has called you to achieve, right? That God has called you to achieve. And so one of my favorite parts of this strategy is I talk about how every situation has a common denominator, and that common denominator is you. That's why we have to look from within. Yes, we have external enemies that we can't control that may declare war on us, but oftentimes we have a common enemy within each situation, and that common enemy is the enemy from within. You see, it's easy to point outwardly to cast blame. It's easy to say them and they and all that other stuff, which that may be true to some extent, but oftentimes it's us. Oftentimes it's us. Jesus looked at his inner man. He retreated for 40 days, went on a fast to address his inner man being in an earth suit to show us what it takes to get the flesh up under subjection, to gain authority over the flesh, right? He showed us that he would not be subject to his flesh, but rather that his flesh would be subject to him, right? That his flesh would submit, and that there would be no war waging on the inside of him, but that he would bring it up under complete subjection. That's why Paul even writes in the New Testament that the war between flesh and spirit is ongoing. That's an internal war. But Jesus, God in the flesh, gave us a strategy on how to deal with that. And I talk about that here in the book. Even David, the king of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, in Psalms chapter 51, he cried. He said, in Psalms chapter 51, David, of course, was considered a man after God's own heart, but he cried out to God to help him blot out his inner enemy. Right? In Psalms chapter 51, when you read Psalms chapter 51, you'll see where David cried out to God in utter distress to blot out his inner enemy. And my grandmother used to always say something about the concept of being tired of yourself, right? When you're tired, you'll make a change. That's what my grandmother used to say. She told my uncle that, and my uncle told me that. When you're tired, you'll make a change. And so that's an idea and a concept from my grandmother, in which you have no other option. When you are tired of experiencing what you are experiencing, you will make a change. You will leave no room to experience that situation ever again. And it's even in my situations, the reason why I wrote this book and the things that I've gone through, the treachery and the betrayal of people, that I made a vow before God and all the host of heaven that I would not be a victim anymore because I was tired. Right? I was tired. I would not be naive anymore, and I would not be a victim to my circumstances anymore. I would not be a victim of the negativity that others dished out on me. Even when we look in the Bible and we see Jonah, talk about it here in the book. Jonah was running away from what God was calling him to. Therefore, it caused Jonah to get on a boat with people that had nothing to do with his situation, and he impacted their situation negatively. When Jonah got on the boat, the storm came, the water in the ocean got aggressive. These people thought that they were going to perish. They started calling out to their various gods and all this other stuff, trying to figure out who got on this boat with their problems that's impacting us. And they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And they was like, Jonah, we got to get you off this boat. Do you see what your inner enemy can do? Your inner enemy can cause other people to be casualties of what you're going through. When you refuse to address your inner enemy can cause you to be a casualty to those around you, meaning that they were literally bystanders, innocent bystanders, and the moment that you came around, their life got worse. Right? They started experiencing drama. They started experiencing things that they never had to experience before you came into their life or came into their environment, all because you won't address your inner enemy. You won't address your inner enemy. External enemies are equipped for war. I talk about this in the book. They believe that they have more time, resources, and energy than you to wage war on you, usually thinking of you less than them. This happens spiritually and it happens socially. Daniel, as I write about in the book, had an experience where he devoted his life to prayer. And Satan thought that Daniel was less, that he would wage a war on Daniel in his prayer life. He would try to hold up Daniel's prayer from getting answered. So much so that the archangel Michael had to get involved. Because again, this happens even spiritually, where Satan will literally try to block what God has for you. Satan will try to block what God has for you when he sees that you are going to push God's agenda forward. Right? And we usually form enemies when we offend some part of their self-opinion, right? Satan thinks that he is high and mighty, thinks that he has all the influence, right? Thinks that he has all the influence. And in that, he waged a war against Daniel to prohibit Daniel from getting the answer that he was asking God for. That God sent reinforcement to make sure that Daniel received the answer that he needed. Because again, Daniel was fully devoted to God, and Satan was completely opposed to this plan of Daniel being devoted to God. And so Satan's main agenda was to thwart the plan of God by trying to oversee that Daniel never got his prayer answered when you read Daniel chapter 10, verses 7 through 14. So Daniel became an enemy to Satan when he was praying about the purposes of God. And Satan would stop at nothing to see that Daniel would be stopped. Right? Even further, winning can create enemies. Right? Winning can create external enemies. David's winning spirit turned Saul, who was his mentor, into an enemy. When you read 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 6 through 9. David had been successful in battle, and the people were celebrating David, saying that he killed tens of thousands. But they only said that Saul, who was David's mentor, only killed thousands. And that winning nature offended David's mentor, Saul, to where Saul wanted to wage war against David to try to get rid of him. Because David's winning spirit created an external enemy out of Saul, who was his mentor. Right? David created an external enemy out of his mentor, Saul, because of his winning spirit. And so the idea of overcoming bad situations is being able to identify your external enemies and to examine and identify the enemy from within. Because a lot of times we declare war on ourselves. Yes, it's people externally that declare war on us, but oftentimes we declare war on ourselves. Oftentimes we declare war on ourselves. Like for me, for instance, I was naive to how my zealous nature could offend other people. Right? I was oblivious to that fact. I didn't know. I just thought that being me was enough. But clearly it wasn't. Right? And I write here in the book from what I read that nothing is stable in the realm of power, and even the closest friends can be transformed into the worst of enemies. Right? Could be transformed into the worst enemies. And so you have to be aware about how your disposition can offend others and cause you to create external enemies. And remember, enemies are those who do anything to stop your forward progress. This is strategy 4, right? Strategy 4 about being able to identify the 2 types of enemies. Thank you so much for tuning in to this overview of strategy 4 of my latest book, Why Me? 5 strategies for how good people can overcome bad situations. Be sure to grab your copy. All of the information will be below in the description box. Physical copy, PDF copy, or even the audio book. Thank you so much for your time. Until next time, friends. Peace.
May the Lord bless you, keep you, and make his face shine upon you. As we abide in his grace, presence, and peace, remember that you are an agent of change wherever your feet shall tread. Thanks for listening to this message and for the opportunity to teach and lead you. Until next time.